Thank you very much for this generous introduction. Can you hear me from this? I'm not sure this is working, but all right. I'll try to speak loudly, but I think, yeah. All right. Now, can you hear me? No? No. All right. I shall wait till. Here you go. Is this the same? I can't hold it to read.
I will. Go ahead.
All right. Yeah. Is this one working? This one is working? Okay, excellent. Thank you. That would be easier now. All right. Thank you very much for this generous introduction. I'm very honored to be here. I thank Dar Al Janub for hosting me. This is my second time in Vienna. I came 6 years ago to also give a talk, and I'm very happy to be back. Is the voice clear? I hear a kind of echo. Is that all right? It's fine? All right. Okay. Brilliant. So good evening to everyone. Thank you all for coming this evening, and I thank all who are following us online. Again, very happy to be speaking and addressing not only a large audience here in Vienna, but also a larger one online. In their attempt to cleanse the newly invented Europe from everything, I don't think this is working. Is this the reason?
Maybe.
All right. I'll try one more time. In their attempt to cleanse the newly invented Europe from everything that was un-Christian and therefore un-Western, enlightened Europeans invented in the late 18th century what they called the Eastern question and its subsidiary, the Jewish question. Both questions were to become central to European imperial aims of splintering the Ottoman Empire and taking over its territories. By the early 20th century, as the First World War was coming to a close, these enlightened Europeans opted to resolve the two questions by transmuting them through colonialism into what they called the Palestine question. The Eastern question was the question of the East encroaching on the West, which was the question of the Ottoman Empire that had to be defeated. Its defeat was finally at hand by the close of World War I, and with it the West resolved the Eastern question. As for the Jewish question, it was related to the persistence of the East within the West, which enlightened and unenlightened European Christians found intolerable. It is true that both Judaism and Christianity are Palestinian religions. It is also an established historical fact that the inhabitants of what comes to be called Europe later, whether Christians or Jews, had converted to these Palestinian religions centuries after the Palestinians had. It is also true that these new Christians of what would become Europe never thought of themselves as direct descendants of the ancient Palestinian Christians who spoke Aramaic, but saw themselves correctly as more recent converts to this Palestinian religion. Yet, these same Christian converts often insisted that converts to Judaism in what would become Europe were somehow descendants of the ancient Palestinian Hebrews who also spoke Aramaic at the time of the so-called Roman expulsion of the first century. This was important because these converts to Christianity accused the converts to Judaism of killing the Palestinian Christ. Still later, neither Orthodox nor Catholic Christianities ever thought of expelling these Jews to Palestine. Nor did these converts to Judaism ever seek to emigrate en masse from their countries to Palestine either. As converts to Christianity pondered the geography from which the faith to which they converted had originated, they decided that this geography must come under their jurisdiction. This was the origin of the first European Christian Zionism that came to be known as the Crusades. The Protestants, the fundamentalist Christians of the Renaissance, became obsessed with European Jews, again seeing them not as local converts to Judaism, but as somehow still connected to ancient Palestine, and began to call for their so-called return to the Holy Land as part of the millenarian project to expedite the second coming of Christ. European Jews resisted, and along with their American co-religionists, still resist these calls of mass self-expulsion from Europe and the United States to a distant Asian land. It is in this context that enlightened Europeans posed what they called in the late 18th century the Jewish question, as a question of foreign Oriental Asiatics living in Occidental Europe. Napoleon called on French Jews to make sure they did not still practice Oriental Judaism, which allowed men, or Jewish men, to marry more than one wife, before he accepted them as equal citizens in post-revolutionary France. A delegation of French Jews assured him that European Ashkenazi Jews banned such un-Christian heresies in the 12th century, and that they were thus practically Christian. Droves of West European Jews rushed to convert formally to Christianity in the 19th century, or to create a new kind of Judaism that they called Reform Judaism, a Judaism that so resembled Christianity one could almost mistake them for one another. Almost. But that was not enough. By the middle of the 19th century, with the rise of the biological and racial sciences, the Jewish question was no longer about a population that had to be de-Europeanized and Asianized in its origins, but one about racial foreignness and inferiority. This unfolded in the age of European nationalisms that often based themselves on common language and territory, but increasingly on the fantasy of a common race. First articulated by European philologists in the late 18th century, the difference between what they called Indo-European or Aryan languages and Semitic languages was transformed in the middle of the 19th century into a biological racial question. Never mind that European Jews did not speak a Semitic language at all. The false claim that they were descendants of the ancient Hebrews was sufficient. That the ancient Palestinian Christians, like ancient Palestinian Jews, spoke Aramaic, which was now designated as a Semitic language, did not, however, render European Christians Semites. They were decidedly Indo-European, and the lucky amongst them, pure Aryans. The response of European Jews to these developments varied and took the shape of four organized responses that vied with one another for the support of Jews as well as Christians. The least powerful group, and which antagonized the majority of Jews, were the Zionists. Founded at a congress in August 1897, this group decided to ally itself consistently with anti-Semites, Protestant millenarians, and imperialists, and adopted a racialized Jewish nationalism that joined European racialized nationalisms in its colonial mission. Its founder, Theodor Herzl, minced no words when he declared, and I quote him, that the anti-Semites will become our most dependable friends, the anti-Semitic countries our allies, unquote. Zionism believed that the Jews were a separate race and nation, and that all Jews must join the Zionist national colonial settler project. The second group was committed to socialism, and included Jews who joined socialist parties and the General Jewish Labor Union in Lithuania, Poland, and Russia, known as the Bund. The Bund was founded a few weeks after the First Zionist Congress in October of 1897. Unlike the Zionists, the Bundists and all other socialist Jews allied themselves with the enemies of anti-Semitism and the enemies of imperialism and racialized nationalism. They saw the Zionists as right-wing enemies of the Jews and of communism. The third group was mostly composed of assimilated Jews of Western Europe and the United States, who believed that their assimilation, and for most of them their Reform Judaism, made them inseparable from the country-specific nations where they resided and from these countries' nationalisms. Thus, German Jews, British Jews, French Jews, and American Jews saw themselves as German, British, French, and American, as most of them still do today. They also fought the Zionists as endangering their status in their own countries. The fourth group was the Orthodox Jews, who in their majority objected to Zionism on religious grounds and saw it as a dangerous anti-Jewish heresy. The assimilated Reform Jews and the Orthodox Jews of Germany joined hands and banned Theodor Herzl from convening the First Zionist Congress in Munich and forced him to move it to the neighboring Swiss town of Basel. The Zionists tried to find allies among the assimilated Jews during World War I, with more success in the US than in Europe. And they tried also with Orthodox Jews. In the case of the latter, they only managed to get a small group of Orthodox Ashkenazi Jews that called themselves the Mizrahi Party to join them. It is in occupying the mantle of anti-communism, however, and in espousing anti-Semitic ideas about the foreignness of Jews and their racialization, as well as their support for imperialism, that the Zionists were able to find much more powerful allies among European Christian colonial powers. Herzl made sure to meet with all European governments that had Asian and African colonies and territories, or were likely to acquire them soon, including Italy, Germany, Portugal, Britain, Russia, and the Ottomans, to gain them as allies and as supporters of his scheme to send European Jews to Palestine. His strategy took some time, but it would be his colleagues in the World Zionist Organization who would reap the benefits of these ties. Herzl's successors would be able to secure a colonial sponsor on the occasion of the first global catastrophe of the 20th century, namely during World War I. But the story begins at the turn of the century. It was Herzl's then British imperialist ally who would set the stage for the Balfour Declaration, namely the British colonial secretary, Joseph Chamberlain. Chamberlain was an imperialist, a Protestant Zionist, and an early enthusiast supporting Jewish Zionism. As a known anti-Semite, he was not solely motivated by his Protestantism, but also by finances and money that could aid British imperialism, which, in line with common anti-Semitic views, he thought the Jews possessed. During the Fourth Zionist Congress held in London in 1900, Theodor Herzl had already postulated that Britain would be key to the Zionist movement. He declared, and I quote him, "From this place, the Zionist movement will take a higher and higher flight. England the Great, with her eyes on the seven seas, will understand us." Unquote. As East European Jews were fleeing anti-Jewish massacres and pogroms to Western Europe, including to Britain and to the United States, British officials who opposed admitting them into Britain set up a commission to deal with the problem. Herzl was invited in 1902 to testify before this commission that was called the Royal Commission on Alien Immigration. Of the 175 witnesses to the commission, he offered a solution to the problem, namely, and I quote him again, a diverting of the stream of migration from Eastern Europe. The Jews of Eastern Europe cannot stay where they are. Where are they to go? If you find that they are not wanted here, then some place must be found to which they can migrate, without that migration raising the problems that confront them here in England. Those problems will not arise if a home is found for them, which will be legally recognized as Jewish. End of quote. It is this testimony that impressed the British Lord Rothschild, who was a member of the Royal Commission as the Jewish representative, and who had been, until that moment, antagonistic toward Herzl and Zionism. Zionist colonization of Palestine would do away with having to deal with Jewish immigrants to Britain. The anti-Semitic and Christian Zionist Chamberlain would soon meet with Herzl to organize how British imperialism and Protestant Zionism can help or could help Jewish Zionism get rid of Britain's Jewish problem. It is in view of this common goal that Chamberlain offered the Sinai Peninsula and El Arish, which Britain controlled, to Herzl as a homeland for the Jews as early as 1903, and soon after also offered British East Africa, or Uganda, for Jewish colonization and the establishment of a Jewish homeland. Chamberlain expectedly opposed Jewish immigration to Britain, and along with the Zionists had other possible destinations for East European Jews fleeing the pogroms. This was not only based on his Protestant Zionism, but also on British imperial designs in the Sinai and the protection of the Suez Canal. When British Prime Minister Arthur Balfour, an ardent Protestant Zionist, shepherded the Aliens Act Bill of 1905 in the House of Commons to ban East European Jewish immigration to Britain, Balfour's concern was to save the country from what he called the undoubted evils of an immigration which was largely Jewish, unquote. Like Chamberlain, the anti-Semitic and Christian Zionist Balfour had in mind another colonial destination for Jewish immigrants. Whereas the 6th Zionist Congress rejected the Uganda offer, it would be the 7th Zionist Congress meeting in Basel again in 1905 that set it aside for good. On account of the Aliens Bill, the 7th Congress condemned Balfour as an anti-Semite and declared that his political views amounted, and I quote, to open anti-Semitism against the whole Jewish people, unquote. But at the same time, the Zionist Congress thanked the British government, headed by Balfour himself, for its pro-Zionist Uganda offer. The Congress registered, and I quote, with satisfaction the recognition accorded by the British government to the Zionist organization in its desire to bring about a solution of the Jewish problem, and expressed a sincere hope that it may be accorded the further good offices of the British government where available in any matter it may undertake in accordance with the Basel Programme of colonizing Palestine. Chamberlain and Balfour both believed in the superiority and unique virtues of the Anglo-Saxon race. Balfour also, like the Jewish Zionists, believed that the Jews, and I quote, were a people apart and not merely held a religion differing from the vast majority of their fellow countrymen, unquote. As late as 1914, Balfour told his friend Chaim Weizmann that he shared many of Cosima Wagner's anti-Semitic views of German Jews. At the time, Weizmann was busy selling the Protestant Zionist Lloyd George on the Jewish Zionist idea. From 1914 onwards, the Zionists, in the person of the British Jewish politician Herbert Samuel, agreed that once the Eastern question was resolved with the demise of the Ottoman Empire, Jewish colonists would fill the vacuum in Palestine in the interest of British imperial aims, protecting the country from being taken over by Britain's imperialist rivals, the French, or worse, the Germans. Samuel, whose efforts were central to secure British support for Jewish Zionism, would become the first British High Commissioner of Palestine in July 1920. As the Eastern question was being resolved, however, a new question was quickly taking its place as a threat to European imperialist interests, namely that of communism. The spectre of communism, as Karl Marx had predicted, had been haunting Europe for half a century, and the assault on the Paris Commune in 1871, successful as it was, did not do away with the growing threat. But the term anti-Semitism, which was invented here in Vienna in 1879 to distinguish Jews from Aryans racially, not religiously, was soon coupled with anti-communism. While the Zionists were colluding with anti-Semites as to which location Eastern European Jews should be relocated, in Asia, Africa, or Latin America, East European socialists, Jews and Christians alike, were working to end tyrannical and anti-Semitic regimes and free people from their yoke. The association of Jews with communism by anti-Semites was expected. Beginning with Karl Marx's Jewish origins, the conspiracy theory would have it that communism across Europe, and Bolshevism specifically, were part of a Jewish conspiracy to end Western civilization. As the Russian communists, including the Jewish Bund, were gaining ground increasingly after the Kerensky takeover in February 1917 in Russia, and as British troops were approaching Palestine, Balfour, by then he had become the British Foreign Minister, would make his infamous declaration. The British Prime Minister then was Lord George, a fundamentalist Protestant imbued with Protestant Zionism, who needed no convincing of the importance of Jewish Zionism, and neither did the early Zionist Balfour. That their Protestant Zionism was fully compatible with British imperialism was more than fortuitous. The timing of the Balfour Declaration, containing the British pledge to Lord Rothschild and to the Zionists, being issued only 5 days before the triumph of the October Revolution in Russia, was hardly coincidental. The triumph of the Russian communists, Jewish and Christians alike, who were the enemy of anti-Semitism and Zionism, meant that East European Jews had no more reason to emigrate, putting in jeopardy the British imperial and Zionist plans for Palestine. By making the pledge to help secure a so-called national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, the British were offering another venue for East European Jews and egging them not to support the communists. Whereas the anti-Semitic claim that communism and Bolshevism were so-called Jewish conspiracies are often attributed to the Nazis, who imported them from the propaganda of the White Russians, in Western Europe it was none other than Winston Churchill who first articulated clearly the stakes of communism as a so-called Jewish conspiracy to take over the world versus Zionism as a colluder with imperialism, and which offered an imperial solution to what was called the Jewish problem. In an article that Winston Churchill published in the Sunday Herald in February 1920, Churchill expressed support for assimilated Jews who identified with their country of citizenship, but thought of them as outside the power equation that he wanted to explicate, namely, the equation between Zionism and communism. He started by heaping scorn on what he termed international Jews, and identified communism as a Jewish, and I quote, worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization, unquote. I will quote a much larger segment from this article, as it is most important. Churchill continues, "The fact that in many cases Jewish interests and Jewish places of worship are accepted by the Bolsheviks from their universal hostility has tended more and more to associate the Jewish race in Russia with the villainies which are now being perpetrated. It becomes therefore especially important to foster and develop any strongly marked Jewish movement which leads directly away from these fatal associations. And it is here that Zionism has such a deep significance for the whole world at the present time." Churchill continues, "Zionism offers the third sphere to the political conceptions of the Jewish race. In violent contrast to international communism, it presents to the Jew a national idea of a commanding character. It has fallen to the British government as the result of the conquest of Palestine to have the opportunity and the responsibility of securing for the Jewish race all over the world a home and a center of national life. The statesmanship and historic sense of Mr. Balfour were prompt to seize this opportunity. Declarations have been made which have irrevocably decided the policy of Great Britain," unquote. Churchill finally offers us his conclusion. This is what he says. I quote him again. "Zionism has already become a factor in the political convulsions of Russia, as a powerful competing influence in Bolshevik circles with the international communistic system. Trotsky has attacked the Zionists generally, and Dr. Weizmann in particular. The cruel penetration of Trotsky's mind leaves him in no doubt that his schemes of a worldwide communistic state under Jewish domination are directly thwarted and hindered by this new ideal, this new Zionist ideal, which directs the energies and the hopes of Jews in every land towards a simpler, a truer, and a far more attainable goal. The struggle which is now beginning between the Zionist and Bolshevik Jews is little less than a struggle for the soul of the Jewish people." End of quote. Zionism's enmity toward communist Jews would become a long-standing tradition. When official American anti-Semitism targeted Jewish communists as Soviet spies and tried and executed the Rosenbergs in 1953 on flimsy evidence, Israel did not utter a word in protest. When Hungarian fascists and Hitlerites were smuggled into Budapest from the Austrian border by the CIA during the regime of Imre Nagy and began slaughtering Hungarian communist Jews and Hungarian Jews as communists in 1956, Israel and other Zionist Jews remained silent and remain so today. Even when leftist Jews were targeted by the anti-Semitic Argentinian generals in the late 1970s, Zionist Argentinian Jews and Israel disavowed them, and Israel maintained its close alliance with the anti-Semitic generals. Churchill's explanation clarifies the connections between Protestant and Jewish Zionism, between racialist nationalism and anti-racialist communism, and between Zionist settler colonialism and communist anti-imperialism. The imperial racism shared by the British and the Zionist movement toward the Palestinians and other Asians and Africans rendered their presence on their lands, let alone their opposition and resistance to settler colonialism, of no import. Balfour himself insisted, and I quote him, that Zionism, be it right or wrong, good or bad, is rooted in age-long traditions, in present needs, in future hopes, of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices that some 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit that ancient land. Unquote. It was left to Lord Sydenham, a British Conservative Member of Parliament, to identify with the Palestinians against Zionism. The Jews, Lord Sydenham said, and I quote him, had no more right to Palestine than the descendants of the ancient Romans had to England. The story of the last century of Zionist colonialism and Zionist colonization of Palestine that the British sponsored and continue to sponsor, and the Palestinian resistance it has fostered, remain with us today. Early Palestinian protests and opposition to the theft of their country and lands by European converts to Judaism, facilitated by European converts to Christianity, were dismissed as baseless. In his meetings with the British government in 1923, the Jewish Zionist British official Herbert Samuel insisted that Arab opposition to Zionism was based on a misunderstanding of its goals, and that responsible Zionist leaders did not intend to confiscate Arab lands or flood the country with Jewish immigrants. Yet, all that the Palestinians feared and expected came true, but all that the Christian and Jewish Zionists expected did not. The Palestinians did not surrender and continue to fight against Zionist colonialism and racism today. Israel has killed over 100,000 Palestinians and Arabs since 1948. Thousands more were killed by the British and the Zionists between 1917 and 1948. Israel has expelled half the population of historic Palestine, who continue to live in exile, while the other half lives under different racist and colonial laws and regulations inside Israel and in the West Bank and Gaza. The majority of the world's Jews today live in their countries of origins and refuse to go to Israel. These include the majority of American Jews, of Latin American Jews, of French Jews, of Russian Jews and British Jews, among others. When the Balfour Declaration was issued in 1917, a majority of British Jews opposed it. When the US government endorsed the declaration soon after its issuance, 300 prominent public American Jewish figures, including congressmen, rabbis, intellectuals, and businessmen, signed petitions against it. This Jewish opposition remained strong until the end of World War II. While the Zionist movement and Israel were able, after the Nazi Holocaust and after 1948, to sway world Jewry from their former opposition to Zionism, they have failed to convince a majority of them to leave their countries and move to Israel. The majority of Jews who did go to Israel went there not out of ideological commitment, but fleeing oppression and denied any other destination. In the case of Arab Jews, Israel organized attacks on them, as the Massad had done in Iraq, to spur their emigration. Yet Israel's colonial oppression of the Palestinian people and the theft of their lands proceed apace. Meanwhile, the Eastern question, the Jewish question, and the communist threat have all been transmuted into the Palestine question, which persists against all odds in the form of Zionist settler colonialism. All the efforts to defeat the Palestinian people by Britain, Israel, France, Germany, and the United States, not to mention many Arab countries, have failed over the last century. British Prime Minister Theresa May's recent renewed pledge to the Zionists that the United Kingdom will mark the Balfour Declaration's centennial with pride is in fact an expression of pride in the anti-Semitic, anti-communist, and racist colonial legacy of Britain, which she and her allies in the British government insist on perpetuating in the land of the Palestinians and on the Palestinian people. Theresa May recently declared, and I quote her, "We are proud of the role that we played in the creation of the State of Israel, and we will certainly mark the centenary with pride," unquote. Like Arthur Balfour before her, Theresa May refused to even name the Palestinian people. If the Balfour Declaration referred to the Palestinians as the non-Jewish communities in Palestine, Theresa May refers to them as, quote, "some people." Let me quote her to you. She said last week, "We also must be conscious of the sensitivities of some people that some people have about the Balfour Declaration. We recognize that there is more work to be done," unquote. The collaborationist Palestinian Authority that collaborates with the enemy of the Palestinians has threatened to sue Britain over its celebration of the centennial unless the latter offers a mere apology to the Palestinian people for having issued the declaration in the first place. Such obsequiousness is to be expected from a Palestinian Authority whose sole purpose has been to suppress Palestinian resistance to Israeli colonialism and which has worked assiduously in the last quarter century to repress the political and national rights of the Palestinian people. But a century on, Zionist colonialism is no more secure than it ever was, and lacks a sense of permanence today as much as it did back in 1917. That official Britain, as Theresa May's pride demonstrates, has been and remains an implacable enemy of the Palestinian people is not in dispute. As for the more work to be done, as she put it, in which her country should be involved, it is the urgent necessity that Britain should be put on trial, not only for issuing the infamous declaration, but also for all its past and present crimes against the Palestinian people. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Massad, for this very inspiring and very thought-provoking lecture you gave. I'm going to open the floor now to questions from the audience and also for questions from the live stream, comments on the live stream. I would like to remind you again that the main language of questions will be English. If you want or need to ask a question in German, feel free to do so. We're going to translate it. Please keep your questions short and sweet so that as many people as possible will have the opportunity to ask a question. As long as there are people wanting to ask questions who have not yet had the opportunity, I will not call people who have already had the chance, right? So if there's somebody here who had not the chance yet to speak, they will be first before people have to will be able to repeat the question. Is that all right with everybody? So I'm going to open, before I open the floor, I'm going to pose a question that already came in yesterday. Hold on a second, by Dr. Ali Huwaidi, who is a Palestinian journalist from Lebanon. He's a former employee of the Palestinian Return Center and today is General Director and Coordinator for 302 NGOs who defend refugees' rights. And his questions to you are, why exactly should Britain apologize for the Balfour Declaration? And after Britain violated its role of mandating Palestine, can Britain be tried in the courts?
Well, I think my lecture sort of answered the question. Is this working?
No.
There seems to be a problem with your microphone. Can you fix it? Is it working now?
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Okay. I think my lecture sort of addressed this question, right? I'm not really interested in a British apology whatsoever, really. I mean, what is an apology at this point? Britain has committed numerous crimes against the Palestinian people. It has committed those crimes not only in 1917, but within a few weeks after. It actually issued the declaration, and it occupied Palestine in December of 1917 until its departure in May of 1948. The amount of crimes and murder of thousands of Palestinians, the destruction of Palestinian homes, the violation of the law by actually facilitating Zionist colonization and sales of land, all of that were part of the numerous British crimes that have been very well documented. Its continued support even of the expulsion by the Zionists of the Palestinians between November 29th, 1947 or November 30th, 1947, when the Zionist expulsion started, until May 14th, 1948. And this is before the Arab armies tried to intervene in the areas that were set aside for the Palestinian state by the United Nations, during which the Zionists expelled about 400,000 Palestinians. Almost half the Palestinians who were expelled before the intervention of the Arab armies and under the jurisdiction of the British. So the British are responsible for murder, for torture, for the destruction of homes, for the confiscation or illegal sale of Palestinian property, as well as for aiding and abetting the expulsion by the Zionists. These are all major crimes that Britain should be taken to court for, and not simply, as the obsequious Palestinian Authority has asked, that it apologize for the declaration. The apology is absolutely meaningless. Britain must be made to actually pay for its crimes legally in courts of law.
Thank you very much for that answer. Now, the floor is open to questions from the audience who wants to take the opportunity and ask Massad a question. The microphone for the floor is there, so if anybody raises their hand, you get the microphone. Over there.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
It's not a question for me, it's kind of, I would say, it's comment. For me, I come from Palestine, but I was not born there. I just have the Palestinian passport. I was born in Saudi Arabia, so for me, when I came here to Vienna, I'm living in Austria since 2 years, I start to ask myself again, to whom I belong? What is my
identity,
exactly. And I thought just, I think if we say the Palestinian conflict or the Palestinian case, we would make it very small. It's not about Palestine, it's about a human being living in a place in the world, they are occupied and they got killed, and somebody give, like Balfour, he give the land to somebody who don't deserve it or has no rights there, just he give them this land and yeah, you can build your own country here. So I would really please everybody not to call it a Palestinian case, it's a human being case, it's bigger than this. Because if we say Palestine, we make it really very small, and it's not like this at all. And I don't think that if Britain says sorry, I mean, it will make no sense. If I broke a glass, you cannot say sorry to a glass, it will not come back again. I mean, even Israel will not say sorry. So I don't think we should wait something from the politician. I think it would be responsibility of a humanity itself. And yeah, the vote should be for human beings, not for politicians, because they will change nothing. Thank you very much.
Just a minute, I forgot to say that. Would you please give your name and introduce which group or organization? Sorry?
Me?
Yeah. I would ask everybody who poses a question or who wants to introduce themselves just shortly before they do it. I'm sorry, I forgot to tell you.
Yeah, sorry. My name is Jihad Al-Khatib. I'm actor from Palestine, so I'm living now in Vienna. So
Hello, Jihad.
thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Well, of course, I fully agree with you. But you see, the problem of the Palestinians is not only the problem of the Palestinians. This is a larger problem of settler colonialism, right? And basically, in addition to the Americas, Australia, and New Zealand, several areas and territories of Asia and Africa were also colonized by European settler colonists. At the time of the settler colonialism in Palestine, we already have settler colonization of places like what was called Rhodesia in Africa, South Africa itself, and Algeria. Right? Remember, when Algeria got its independence in 1962, it was one. Before that moment, it was one of two Arab settler colonies that Europeans were living in and had colonized. When it got independence in 1962, the idea was, one settler colony down, one to go. Right? When Rhodesia got its independence as Zimbabwe back in 1980-81, also the idea was that, okay, one more settler colony was liberated, and there were two more, South Africa and Palestine. South Africa finally, in 1994, ended political apartheid, while the year before, in 1993, the Oslo Accords created even a worse system than the apartheid that existed in South Africa, which ended in 1994, with, of course, the full collaboration of the Palestinian leadership. So you are right. The problem of the Palestinians is a global problem of settler colonialism. Today, Native Americans, First Nations of Canada, Aborigines in Australia, the Maoris of New Zealand continue to live in settler colonies where white settlers, in fact, rule. So the Palestinians are not alone in this situation. True, they are perhaps the last settler colony in Asia and Africa, but they're not the last settler colony in the world. So.
Thank you very much. Questions from the audience? There you go.
Good evening. My name is Ghassan Obeid. I am living here in Austria since 26 years. I'm Palestinian and human rights activist. My question is very simple. Why are Britain and the Western countries supporting till now Israel? Since 100 years ago till now. Why are they supporting Israel? Is there economic factors or religious factors, or what is the story, please?
Thank you. I think it's colonial factors as well as some of other factors, racist and religious. But after all, why the U.S. is a settler colony? Why should it not support Israel? Canada is a settler colony. Why should it not support Israel? New Zealand and Australia are both settler colonies. Why shouldn't they support Israel? When South Africa was in the hands of whites, it also supported Israel. Settler colonies support each other, of course. And historically, many Latin American countries also supported Israel. And some of them continue to do so today. Remember, even Latin American countries, in many of them, the descendants of white colonial settlers continue to be the governing class and the rich against the natives and people of mixed blood across the continent. So there are actually settler colonial identification with Israel. As for the European countries, after all, Israel does market itself as a European country in the Middle East. It claims to be in the forefront of defending what it calls Western civilization. Remember, after World War II, or around World War II, there was the invented sort of notion of the Judeo-Christian tradition. There was no such thing before the 1940s because, of course, Jews always understood that Christianity tried to destroy Judaism and to build itself on its ruins, that there was no such thing as a Judeo-Christian ethic, but Christianity was always built on ruining Judaism. So, of course, many Jews rightly are offended by the notion of a Judeo-Christian ethic. But, of course, Israel loves it because the whole idea of Zionism was to transform Jews, European Jews, into a version of European Gentiles while still calling them Jews. The idea that Jews should abandon their traditional cultures, their languages, whether it's Yiddish for East European Jews, Arabic for Arab Jews, even Ladino for many Sephardic Jews, and to adopt an ancient language that none of them spoke, right, Hebrew, and modernize it, was part of the idea that European Jews were like European Christians, that they had a national character, they had a language, of course, they supported these Protestant ideas that they did not belong in Europe, even though, of course, in many ways, they were European, right? So the idea Israel claims that it is in the Middle East, but not of it, right? That it is of Europe, but it is in the Middle East. And this is, of course, how the Rhodesian whites saw themselves. This is how white South Africans saw themselves. This is how the Pieds Noirs or the Colons saw themselves in Algeria and elsewhere. So there's nothing unique about this. I mean, what is, of course, interesting is that the support for Israel is justified by many European imperial countries differently depending on the period. Right, so the 50s and 60s, they used different kinds of arguments. The 70s and 80s, another set of arguments. And since the onset of what we now call Islamophobia, they have now a new argument. Right, but ultimately, the Zionists, I guess, were right. The whole idea by the Zionist leadership was that European Christians hated Jews because Jews allegedly did not have a country. So if Jews were, and of course for Herzl believed in a very racist way that Jews themselves caused anti-Semitism, that the presence of Jews in Gentile communities is what causes anti-Semitism. So the only way to end anti-Semitism, as far as Herzl was concerned, was to remove Jews from Gentile communities. And he said, as soon as Jews leave Europe and go somewhere else and have their own country, Europeans will no longer be anti-Semitic and will like them. And we see something very interesting that happened after 1948. Perhaps Herzl was not wrong in that assessment. He understood, it seems to me, white Christian anti-Semitism very well, even if he partook of many of its ideas.
Thank you very much, Professor Massad. I see the next question over there. The gentleman with the blue shirt.
Okay. My question is Arabic or German? Yeah.
Whatever you'd like.
Excuse me, just a minute. Is anybody able to translate that into English for our listeners on the live stream?
I shall try to do that.
Thank you very much.
Ich kann übersetzen, also auf Deutsch gleich. Ich habe kein Problem, ja. Okay. أهلا وسهلا بك يا أنت شرحت موجز كويس يعني عن الوضع.
نعم.
مفهوم شو المشكلة من 1917 لحتى الآن. ولكن المشكلة نحن جميعا هنا فلسطينيين أنت وأنا والجميع من 48. مشكلتنا الآن حتى لو بدنا يعني سلام معهم هم بيرفضوا يقولوا لا ما بدناش يعني احنا اتينا على فلسطين وما في ناس وحتى لو بدك تقول يا عمي حل دولتين يقول لك لا ما بدنا هو الحل اوكي die Geschichte ist für uns alle ich bin Palästinenser aus 48 und es gibt also Leute die Palästinenser aus 48 ja okay die sind gekommen nach Palästina und sagen sie ja schon wir sind nach Palästina, es gibt keine Menschen in Palästina, die sind hier leer, ja? Okay, dann sagen wir, okay, leer hier, leer hin, ja, wir sind Palästinenser hier, wir stehen hier, ich bin Palästinenser und es gibt so viele Palästinenser. Trotzdem, wir schlagen vor Frieden, ja, zwischen den Arabern und die Israelis, zwischen Palästinenser und Israelis, zwischen die Juden und die Araber und trotzdem wollen sie nicht. Und was dann?
Okay, danke.
Okay.
Danke. Do you need it in English for the live stream? Does anybody need the English version? Or okay.
All right. The question has to do with the fact that there are many Palestinians who are in the diaspora who originate from 1948, and that as a result of exile and the continued colonization, even if they want to have peace with Israel, Israel wouldn't agree to it. So what would be the solution to this situation? Is that what the question was? Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not sure Israel doesn't want peace. I mean, in a way, from its own discourse, Israel claims that it wants peace. What Israel says is that, we have the right to be racist against the Palestinians because we were the victims of Europe. And as a result, we have a special right to be racist against Palestinians and to colonize their land. It is not a principle that everyone else should have. Only Zionist Jews should have that right, nobody else. So we don't support everyone else becoming racist, but the Zionists claim that they should have the right to be racist, and that they want peace with the Palestinians. If the Palestinians would only accept Israel's right to be racist and Israel's right to colonize their lands, then there would be peace. The reason why there is no peace in Palestine and that Israel wants so badly is that the Palestinians continue to resist its right to be racist and its right to colonize their lands. If they would stop their resistance, Israel will have peace, you see. So in that sense, the Israelis have always articulated their position as one that wants peace. And the only thing that stands between them and peace is these horrible Palestinians who can't seem to understand that Zionist Jews are special and that they should have the right to be racist and to colonize their country. If they accept that, then everything will be fine.
The problem is in Palestine.
Just a minute, sorry. If anybody wants to ask a question, please use the microphone, otherwise the audience won't be able to hear you. I saw a hand raised here in front. Was there anybody else back there?
So, yes, I'm Eka Sulaiman. I'm from Palestine Solidarity, Syria. And as I catch you right, you say there is 3 questions coming together on the question of Palestine in the past. So it was the question on communism, it was the question for Eastern question, as you call it, and the Jewish question.
As they called it.
As they called it, yes. And so my question is, what is the points today? What is coming together now, today, on the Palestinian case? And as I see it, we have maybe the question of neoliberalism, which is instead of colonialism, if you want to say it like this, maybe they both are together same thing, more or less different names. And we have also, as in past, the question of communism, maybe we have today the question of Islamism. So this is how we look at the movements and the revolutions and revolts in the Arab area in these days, and maybe we can find also, as in the Palestinian case, liberation movements who are also going in the Islamic way, and we can call it maybe an old world movements for liberation also. Maybe you will be on the same meaning as me on this point, but how to overcome? So what is the question for the future? What can we do? What should we do? Isn't it like this, if we came to talk on colonialism, neoliberalism, that we need a worldwide movement against, and maybe on some level we found in the Durban resolutions, maybe we found some directions who are going in this way, as we can talk maybe on anti-imperialist movements in the world today, or coming together like putting forward Arab Spring. So this is also a point even not declared and even not ended up to today. So what is the connection with Palestine with all these points I mentioned now? This would be my question. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. No, the Eastern question has not ended. It ended, I mean, this is what's interesting, is that what the West has called the Eastern question, or la question d'Orient, as they used to call it in France, was a question of the Ottoman Empire. And the idea was that when communists came, the communists allegedly were again like the Muslims, that they did not believe in countries, allegedly, and therefore seemed to be international in a way that was of concern. And we see, once the communist threat was over, the Islamist threat comes back in the same way that the Eastern question was seen. Also, the Jewish question was not really resolved. I mean, a lot of the anti-Semitism, the very anti-Semitic ideas that governed European Christian minds against Jews are the same ones that are today used against Muslims. Exactly the same. That the Jews allegedly controlled the money of the world, now they say Arabs or Muslims control money. The idea that Jews would poison the wells of Christians, today it is the horrible Muslims who want to kill them or use nuclear weapons against them and poison them. The ideas are all the same. The idea that there's an international conspiracy of Muslims and Islamists is the same idea that there was an international conspiracy of Jews. So in many ways, the only difference is that after the 1960s, Europe and the US decided that Jews were no longer non-white people. They whiteified them, and they became part of white Europe. But all the hatred toward the Oriental Jews, now since Jews were found out not to be Oriental, that after the Holocaust and after the murder of millions of Jews, when Europeans decided that Jews were not Oriental and they should not have killed them because they were white people, they decided that they can continue to hate all those other Orientals that they thought the Jews were. Right? And those other Orientals are Arabs and Muslims and other Asians and Africans. So today, the anti-Muslim racism in Austria or in Germany or in France or in England is a continuation of anti-Semitism. A complete continuation. It's exactly the same kind of racism that was used. Right? And remember, one of the interesting things today that some Germans or Austrians or even French or Dutch use to justify their Islamophobia is by claiming, well, because we are so against anti-Semitism and we think Muslims hate Jews, so we hate them for hating Jews, right? So this is the kind of discourse that continues the same kind of hatred and anti-Semitism by so-called Germans who are not racist or Austrians who are not racist, but are concerned about the so-called racism of Muslims. So in that sense, the Eastern question has remained the same. The Jewish question has remained the same in many ways. And this is why I said, and the question of communism or transnationalism also stays the same with Muslims. So in the 19th century, you have Jews as being allegedly a tribal society with no national affiliations and a threat to the nation state. Then you have communists who are also like the Jews, allegedly cosmopolitans, international, and not to be trusted within the framework of the nation state. And now you have, again, Muslims being understood in very, very similar terms as Jews and communists were before them. So I think the three questions remain with us. And in many ways, they continue to be focused in the Palestine question as one of the more prominent questions where they intersect. So in that sense, it is a question of the present, not only a question of the past, I think. And yes, in many ways, certain kinds of political, or what they call political Islam or Islamisms, are seen as the only force in the world that resists the European-wide call for liberalism. Right, so in a way, Muslims, and especially Islamists, but usually it's spoken this way about all Muslims, that Muslims allegedly oppress women, that Muslims oppress homosexuals, and hate Jews. Remember, all these groups were always, not very much liked or supported by the European right. In the last 20 years, right-wing white Europeans who never supported feminists or women's rights, never supported the sexual rights of minorities, and always were anti-Semitic, decided that they should change their mind on these questions and target Muslims. And now they tell us they hate Muslims because allegedly Muslims hate women, homosexuals, and Jews. Right? All of this is very much part of a white European racialism that in many ways and often tries to mask itself as a kind of liberalism. And in order to justify its wars, its discrimination, what we call Islamophobia, among many of its atrocities that are ongoing.
And neoliberalism?
Neoliberalism is just sort of the latest part of capitalism. This is, in a way, imperialism has always, imperialism was always capitalist. Neoliberalism is the latest phase, the post destruction of the Soviet Union phase, right? In many ways, when the Soviet Union existed, European countries, West European countries and the US were very concerned about the Soviet threat. In the US in the 1930s, you had 500,000 members of the Communist Party. This was seen as very dangerous. As a result, you have the welfare state that emerges, where the state takes it upon itself to reform capitalism and begins to provide services to its people so that they won't turn communist and join the Soviet Union. As a result, you have the welfare state, which continues until the 1980s when Reaganism comes about and Thatcherism come about, and they destroy the Soviet Union, and the threat and the reason for having had a welfare state to begin with is no longer with us. As a result, you begin to see the dismantling of the welfare state in Britain, in the US, and elsewhere, because there's no longer a communist threat. So capitalists said, why should we continue to pay taxes? Why should we still have social programs? There is no communist threat anymore. Let's go back to where we were before World War I. Right? In many ways, we have a situation that has taken us back to before World War I. Of course, the economy has changed considerably, but the idea of the state as a locus of social service is no longer acceptable. So the World Bank and the IMF, for example, when they talk about balancing the budget of a third world state, they never tell them to stop supporting the army or the police or the intelligence services. On the contrary, they allow them to continue to build more and more in their budget items that and financial commitments to the army, to the police, to intelligence services. What they insist on is that they should cut all social services to their populations, right? And this is part of what, so neoliberalism claims not to believe in the state except as a repressive force against the poor. So that is where the state must still have a very important role and therefore continue to be the major apparatus that governs in a protective way the neoliberal economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next question. Take the opportunity. So first one was here, second one was there.
Hi, my name is Malak Hayat. I'm coming from Lebanon and I'm studying in Budapest. My question to you is, in the recent years there has been an emerging trend from activists and academics calling for the creation of one state in historic Palestine that incorporates both Jews and Palestinians and that gives Palestinians the right to return, which was missing from the Oslo Agreement and the ongoing peace process. To what extent do you think this solution is realistic as compared to the creation of two states?
Thank you. Well, clearly, the two-state solution has been pursued since 1936, when the British actually issued the Peel Commission and suggested the partition of Palestine. Again, that was renewed formally in 1947 by the United Nations. Billions of dollars have been spent in supporting the idea of two states. And after about 80 years, it has failed considerably. Yet, all those supporters of the two-state solution tell us that the two states is a practical solution, but the one state isn't. After 80 years and tens of billions, possibly hundreds of billions of dollars spent on the possible solution of a two states has not come to be, we are told that the two-state solution is still practical, while a one-state solution is not. Of course, we already have a one-state solution. Israel has been in control of all of Palestine since 1967. Right? The problem is it's a racist colonial country that has different tiers of rights and lack of rights for different kinds of populations. It has over 50 laws that discriminate against non-Jews and that privilege Jews racially and colonially, and gives a gradational kind of amounts of rights and privileges to different kinds of Palestinians, those who live in Israel, those who live in West Jerusalem and East Jerusalem, those who live in the West Bank, those who live in Gaza, and of course none for diaspora Palestinians. So in that sense, of course, the idea is to decolonize and deracialize the state, right? So the idea of one state, and for those who support it, is a state that will undo and repeal all the racist and colonial laws that exist and that treats all citizens equally. And of course, the reason why the diaspora Palestinians cannot go back to Palestine is because there's a law. There are laws in Israel, racist laws, that prevent them from doing so. If those laws are repealed, there would be no legal reason for them not to go back. Of course, the main reason why they cannot go back is because they're not Jewish. Right? That is part of the racist law. So in many ways, the idea of one state has not really been tried. Billions of dollars have not been spent on it. Unlike the two-state solution, it seems to me a much more workable and democratic possibility, and clearly a much more practical one than the so-called two-state solution, which only a coterie of Palestinian elites who have benefited from the occupation and colonialism continue to want to push for. Right?
Thank you very much. The gentleman in the front row, please.
Yeah.
Sorry. Front row.
First, I congratulate Dar Al Janub for having the mood to organize such a meeting. Then I pick up the first intervention. My name is Joseph Pampal. I'm 80 plus, but I'm a witness of 50 years of settler colonialism in Africa and a witness of overcoming it. And this I want to convey to young people. As the first one said, it's a question of humanity. But as you said, any racist settler is convinced he has a right to be racist. And white settlers, I was in Southern Africa, and the white couldn't see how the black people, under which condition they were living. And the conditions were made worse and worse, but they still were convinced we have a right. It's even an alliance of God with us who gave us this country where there were no people, because the black were no people. But after 94, as you said, they realized we had lost our own humanity. And by ending racism, overcoming apartheid, we were not only liberating the black people, but we were liberating the white as well. We have a chance to become human again. It's still a process going on. But now comes my question. Omar Bakut, in a book outside, he said, now Palestinian people, but all humanity, we are confronted with a juridical war. Juridical war, because those who are racist, they see the world in a different way, upside down, and they always say the others are racist. And if you criticize them, you are an enemy. And that is what is happening now. Even Dar Al Janub was not able to get a room in Vienna, and other organizations can't get a room because there is a juridical war, a campaign to prevent, to accuse everybody of being anti-Semite. And so, even last week, Haaretz published an article on this organization based in Chicago, a law firm which has a contract with the ministry in Israel to organize, even with an office in Munich and in Brussels, to systematically persecute those who criticize racism, to accuse them of being anti-Semite and so on. And they are very well organized, like in the US you have the AIPAC, in Europe you have the European Friends of Israel, you have the manipulation of use of politicians, of members of parliament, of European Parliament, and really the juridical conflict. Palestine had not been prepared. Even here the Europeans are not prepared, are not realizing how serious this is. So I want to ask you how you see this new stage and new dimension of confrontation. Thank you.
Thank you
for your question.
Thank you very much for your contribution as well.
Thank you for your question. Listen, I think clearly BDS and the movement of boycott sanctions against Israel in the last 12, 13 years has been quite successful. Slow but significant success in Europe, in Canada, in the US, and elsewhere. This has not been easy on the Israelis. Some people would like to believe or would like to tell us that BDS ultimately is not that effective. Well, they should check with the Israeli government, with the American government, and with European governments and all their efforts to actually fight BDS so as to know how effective BDS has been. Now, BDS, of course, is only one method of resisting Israeli colonialism and racism. A very important and central method, but it's one method. Yet it has been seen increasingly as one of the most dangerous ones because, of course, it is a peaceful method and it is a legal method. So they try to criminalize it through inventing new laws. Now, I think most Europeans understand this. There are people who support Israel, support colonialism, and are racist. Some Europeans are not interested in this and would like to see it as undermining democratic rights, as undermining even the law. So yes, there is a juridical war among many of the wars facing the Palestinian people and facing their supporters. There is a juridical war, but it's a war that has to continue, that continues, and the resistance will continue. And I think our event this evening is one such triumph that indeed Dar Al Janub was able to book a room. I am able to speak to a large local audience, and these small triumphs are important. They cannot block news. They cannot block people all the time from speaking. They have some successes, but they have to be fought. And during South Africa, the South Africa War, remember, for a long time, the boycott was initially in the 1960s not obligatory on members, right? It only became obligatory later in the 70s, and many countries continued to support South Africa. In the 1980s, we heard all kinds of arguments by President Reagan at that time, speaking of what he called constructive engagement, that in fact the boycott of South Africa, and Reagan was telling us that we should believe him, would hurt black people in South Africa, and that he was concerned. And of course many black leaders responded by saying, we don't mind being hurt by the boycott, we are more hurt by apartheid. Although, of course, the end of political apartheid in South Africa did not bring an end to economic apartheid. White people remain the largest owners of property and wealth in South Africa. That was the deal that was brokered to end political apartheid in South Africa. It was a deal that said we will maintain economic apartheid and we maintain the money and the wealth in the hands of white people. And black people today, as many of you probably know, in South Africa are poorer than they were in 1994 as a result of this deal, even if they now have political rights that do not translate into economic rights. But of course, the Palestinians, given the horrible situation and the horrible deal that their leadership, their sellout leadership, concluded at Oslo in 1993, would find this deal almost paradise compared to what they got, which is actually political and economic apartheid, continued colonization, and the terrorism of the Israeli army against them, both inside Palestine and its juridical arms around the world. But listen, I derive hope from the fact that this has been going on since the 1880s, and they thought the Palestinians will surrender and will be defeated, right? Ben Gurion said that the old will die and the young will forget. Well, the old might have died, but the young have not forgotten. Not because they have great memories, but because Israeli oppression has not stopped, you see. It continues, and therefore the resistance to it continues. And I think sort of BDS, the resistance to these anti-democratic laws, must continue. And I think you're right. European and American liberals are realizing that Palestine is a weak link, that the right-wing fascists are able to introduce all kinds of right-wing restrictions on democratic rights through the Palestine question. First, because there's a consensus among Europeans on the left and on the right that Palestinians deserve no support, that they all support Israel. And soon after, you begin to have larger questions being lost to the right. So Palestine, this is what we saw, for example, at US universities about 13, 14 years ago. The attempt to squash free expression in universities, academic freedom on the Palestine question, today has moved much more starkly to defend white supremacists' right to speak at universities without being questioned by students who oppose them. My own university, Columbia University, last week began to discipline 17 students who stood and tried to respond to a white racist supremacist who was invited to our campus to speak. This became possible because of the restrictions on speech on those who tried to articulate positions that defended the Palestinians against Israeli violations 10, 15 years ago. So yes, the Palestine question is an entry point for the larger agenda of the right.